I'm Monica Costa. I'm the editor of Londommums magazine, and from today, we are launching a love column, a relationship column specifically, with a love coach. Our love coach is Thomas Westenholz. Is a founder of Zensensa, of the website www.zensensa.com. Is a serial entrepreneur who has been featured in The Guardian, The Sun, and other news outlets. But also, more specifically for our purpose here, he trained in somatic relationships and sexuality in San Francisco, and is the author of 2 books in relationship dynamics. Hi, Thomas.
Hey,
How
Monica.
are you?
Thank you for having me on the show today, the Londommums podcast. I really look forward to our conversation today.
We're going to have a monthly podcast on the topic of love and relationships, whether it's love in a marriage or love as a sort of new to love, or as a single person, or going back to love. And I've heard you talk about the 5 love languages. So can you tell us what they are, and also why they are important to us?
Absolutely. That's a good place to start. So it's a guy called Gary Chapman who came up with this concept, and he's written a book called The 5 Love Languages, which is very popular. And essentially,
good book.
Yeah, it's a great book, and it's a very simple concept, and there's a few different ways. I just want to address first why I think it's important in the first place to even bother about this. And I think there's a few different metaphors we can use. I used to say that we have an emotional bank account in a relationship, and every time we have conflict or things that are stressful and draining, it's kind of like drawing out money or drawing out emotions. And when we, have a good time together, it's like putting in emotions into the bank account and getting into the plus. And if we keep drawing it too down into and at some point, if we get too far into the minus, we can't pay back our debt, and that's when relationships become hard to fix. And other people, I think Gary Chapman, he called it, I think, the love bucket, where he said we need to make sure we keep each other's love bucket full, so it doesn't get drained and suddenly it's empty. And there's even this simple thing, when people are aware of their love languages, of just asking your partner, how full is your love bucket? And then you kind of have an idea of, do they need a bit of their love language now? Are they good? And also another reason it's so important is that very often we give our own love language to our partner. So I'm very touchy-feely, so I will often give touch to my partner. But the interesting thing is that might not be what makes them feel valued and loved. Mm-hmm. So we can put in a lot of effort. I might give my partner daily massages, and yet she doesn't feel very loved, and she doesn't feel very taken care of and very valued. And that might come as a big surprise to me, and suddenly I feel, but I spent all this energy trying to make you feel good, and it's simply because you didn't understand each other's love language. So instead, and Gary have a simple test on his website. I think it's free, that people can do, that will tell you, out of these 5 love languages, which one of them is touch, the other one is quality time, which is normally having somebody's dedicated attention. So, turn off the TV, put away your mobile phones. Word of affirmation, which is basically praise. And again, it does matter because it's still individual, so it's not generic. Somebody who likes word of praise, it doesn't mean that you just should tell them they're great all the time. It might be very specific. Something that they feel insecure about might have a much bigger impact to get praised on than something very generic. And again, then there's gifts, and often this love language is perceived as being superficial, but I think it's important not to have judgment around this, because it isn't superficial. If we look at this from an evolutionary perspective, these are just learned ways of seeing that somebody cares about us. And if somebody is willing to share their resources by giving us something, it's a way of showing we care and we value someone. And the last one is act of service, so basically doing something for somebody else. And we all like these to different degrees, but normally we have 1 or 2 that are like our main one, that are the most important ways that we feel appreciated. I know for me it's touch and quality time, and for other people it's different. So knowing your partners, you can stop wasting energy and time and actually just give them what it is that has the biggest impact.
That's very interesting about this. I think for me, it's quality time rather than touch and feel. I thought my love language was touch and feel as well. But actually, thinking of what you said, I think it's probably more quality time. So, like, spending time creating memories, because as an intellectual, I'm highly intellectual. I um, I kind of go back. My bank account is also made of those memories of emotional connection. And so, personally, I think spending that quality time, it kind of fills my bank account of all these love memories, and they keep me motivated when maybe times are tough. So I
Yeah, and that
think
it's such a good
that would
self.
work for me.
And that's a great self-awareness to have, because then you can communicate that to your partner so they know that too. And also, again, like I said, it's important to become specific, because quality time is not just generic, it's specific then for you. Within quality time,
Yeah,
what does that mean? And then the more specific we can be to our partner, the more likely they can give it to us. I think there's this big myths that come from Hollywood that if you love someone, you should be able to read their mind and you should know, and otherwise you obviously are not in proper connection. And it's nonsense. None of us can read other people's minds. It's just
yeah.
not
I think
possible. Exactly.
communication
So
is obviously
the more,
vital.
that's it. The more you can describe in detail what is quality time for you. Is it sharing specific activities? Is it, how does that look like? And the better your partner know that, the more likely they are to be able to actually give you what you want. And this idea that it takes away the romance to actually express it is simply not true. It actually does the
Hmm.
opposite. You give you a better opportunity to be in connection, to learn to
That's so
communicate
true.
clearly what
Yeah.
you need. What words is it that you like? How I know for me, quality time is that there's no other distractions on. Somebody put their phone away and the television is
Yeah.
off, which it is anyway normally, and that we normally do some kind of activity together. That to me is quality time. And again, it might
And for
look
me
different for
also,
somebody else.
this also means that when you are with someone, it's also a very great way of showing respect and dedication. Maybe you're not together all the time. Maybe you don't have the time to spend quality time as much as you would like to. But if you when you are together, you kind of are present, and you are in that moment. It's just you and the person, and you just throw everything out of the window, phones and communication with the outside world, and you just are present with that person, and that makes the connection even more intense and more, sort of, I'd say, and memorable as well. You can make memories that can fill your love bucket, as you said before. That actually leads to the my second question, which is why is what is key to intimacy and love?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of, I guess, mystery around. People think that it's something magical, and people often say, "Oh, I want to feel the chemistry," and I get that, but the honest truth is that the initial chemistry is not necessarily a very good indicator of how a long-term relationship is going to pan out. So it's not necessarily the best indicator of how to select a future partner, because again, we can get into the honeymoon phase and things are great for a certain period of time, 3 months to 2 years, it can normally last. And then reality hits up and we start seeing each other's irritating habits more. We notice all the things we didn't see. So to actually maintain love and intimacy
Mhm.
is a dedicated and conscious effort. And also, even to develop it, there's certain things that have to be in place. I always say, like a plant needs soil, water, and sun to grow and flourish. Love and
Mhm.
intimacy needs safety. First of all, without safety, there's no way it can grow. And we'll talk more about that later, which is absolutely
Yeah.
critical. It's a foundation. The second part, which we'll talk about here, is vulnerability and acceptance. And Brené Brown, who has done a great TED Talk and written some great books on this, also describe how vulnerability is the only way to intimacy and love, but it's also the most scary because it means choosing to open up. And again, I believe in every moment we have a choice when we relate to someone, whether we open up or whether we close down. And I think again it comes back to safety, because a lot of people will say, oh, it's not safe. And it's true, we've all experienced a lot of shame, a lot of judgment. There's a reason that we hide part of ourselves, even though our biggest desire is actually to show these parts and have them accepted and be seen. That's what we want most. It's one of our core human needs, which is why it's so healing and feels so loving and so intimate. So a way to start feeling whether it's safe is to start expressing smaller vulnerabilities and see how your partner react. You know, how do they talk about other people? Are they judgmental, or are they very accepting? How do they talk about things in general? Do they, you know, when you do express something, do they listen to you even if they might not agree or understand? Do they show acceptance towards your view? And slowly you can then gain more safety if they obviously give you that, and then open up more and more. So that's a good way to slowly establish whether there is that safety. And again, with the element of acceptance, you know, is something we all have to work on. And part of being a more accepting person is to get a better understanding of the world around us. You can do that through traveling, through reading books, through speaking to different kind of people. The more you understand, the less judgmental you become. I know for myself, when I was young, I grew up with a lot of the judgments around female sexuality until I read a book by somebody called Nancy Friday, who wrote a beautiful book exploring female fantasies, and it really opened up my mind and suddenly took away this judgment I had been given by my culture. And instead it suddenly made me realize, wow, what a beautiful mind women have, that they can have these complex, beautiful, descriptive fantasies. And I saw it as a way to learn. So again, I think educate ourselves to start becoming more, you know, the judgment come from a place of fear. We judge what we are fearful of, when we're afraid of losing control. So often it's when we don't understand something that we feel the need to judge it, right? So this is why, again, gaining understanding is how we start becoming more accepting. And it's really one of the biggest gifts that we can give another human being, to give them the acceptance that we all crave. And this is where it's the space where intimacy really opens up, and love. And again, there's a guy who I'd done a podcast with called Joe Block, who did something called the 15-minute relationship fix, which is a simple weekly exercise where people self-reflect first on, you know, something that happened, the impact that their own story had on that, and then they share that vulnerably with their partner without any accusation or blame. They just share how that made them feel, and their partner just sit and listen and accept it. And you know, there's something beautiful again in doing that and just making it a practice. And in the beginning, it might feel a bit weird because it's an exercise, but at some point it just becomes a natural part of your relationship. And when we talked before about quality time, it's this thing again, that it comes down to quality. So you're right, we don't need to have a lot of it. And often we don't, because we have kids, we have work, we have but even sitting down for 15 minutes, putting all distractions away, making the kid do something else, look at each other, look in each other's eyes, because it's really critical. Maybe even have a touch, a hand on each other, and then share this and do this exercise. It's a really good way to just, even with 15 minutes, be able to have, you know, reconnection and build and maintain that intimacy, and also invest into your emotional bank account.
You know what? It's really great what you're saying, because you, first of all, you gave us the visualization that the plant needs soil, water, and sun, and love and intimacy also need the safety and vulnerability and the acceptance to grow. So these are like this visualization is very, very important to, I think safety is definitely very important. Also for intimacy, I think the flow of communication, communicating your needs, both emotionally and maybe physically, and being open to that rather than just being scared of being judged by, all these fantasies that we all have, but we don't necessarily communicate to our partners because we are we're afraid that they might think, oh my God, what is this? This is, like a bit of a, is not appropriate, or this kind of fear. I've had a lot of that, I must say. I've had a lot of that from my Catholic upbringing. Obviously, it certainly influenced the way I approached intimacy. And only over time, reaching middle age, I've actually started understanding that actually I'm missing out by not sharing these things with my partner, because but again, it's a matter of feeling safe with the person you have in front of you, and that person has to sort of treasure this confidence, and these revelations as a and accepting them, and also nurture them in a way, making them their own, and taking them as a precious treasure, treasure chest almost. So I think it's, and then once you achieve that, I think you probably get a little like accomplices in a, in a and you create that a little bit of hide and seek moments, even when you are out and about with other people, you kind of look for that gaze in the crowd, and you kind of know, you know your secrets, but the things you both know and nobody else does. So you create that sort of bubble between the two partners, and it's a safe bubble, an intimate, safe bubble, I would say. I don't
Yeah,
know if you
and
agree.
I absolutely, I think
Yes,
it's a beautiful point, and it's a whole other podcast we should talk about, because I think we had a discussion before this podcast that, there's just the physical sensation of sexuality, but where intimacy happen is when we actually become really naked. And I'm not talking physically naked, but emotionally naked. And that is when we start, like you said, sharing our fantasies with each other, whether people enjoy dirty talking or not, but this is really being emotionally naked and showing ourselves, and being accepted in that space is hugely healing and hugely intimate. And this is where sex become a very, very intimate experience. But you're right, like everything else, it's scary and take courage, because it requires vulnerability of choosing to open up. And again, if you think that your husband or wife or partner will not accept, the things that maybe you have, your fantasies, then start gently, maybe give them a book about fantasies and see how they respond, and ask, what did you think about what you were reading? Then you can get an idea for whether they're judgmental or open. And I said, often if they're judgmental, it's because they're scared. If they have a negative reaction to you sharing a fantasy, it's not because there's anything wrong with you. All your fantasies are beautiful and natural. It's because it intimidates them, and it comes back to safety. So it's important actually to remember that it's actually not a judgment of you. It's them being scared. Maybe they're scared that you'll leave because they can't fulfill it. Maybe they feel inadequate because they know it's something they're not comfortable with. And therefore it's also important to share with your partner before you go into that kind of, intimate sharing, if it's fantasies we're talking about, to also explain to them that there's no expectation for them to have to fulfill this. It's just a fantasy. And fantasies can be beautiful to live out, even in storytelling or in words, doing your sexuality, even without having to do it, etc. And it's just important, because that can take maybe that fear down that might trigger them otherwise.
And I was going to say that we will post all the links to these books and reference material that we are mentioning on the website, on the Londommums website. We will have a love coach column, and we will post all this information there, so the link, so you can read more on the subject. So let's talk about crisis. So why do we often feel disappointment in relationships?
Yeah, I think there's a few different reasons for that. So I think one of the main reasons is simply because we have unrealistic expectations. And I think I want to jump all the way back to when we were actually kids, because if we think about it, when we grew up, we had our parents or our caregivers, whoever they were, that gave us the comfort, the safety, the familiar. And we went out with friends on adventure to explore, to have new experience, to excitement, to develop. And suddenly when we grow up, we try to merge this into one person. We want both the safety, familiarity, but we also want a new and excitement. And it's important that these two live on two opposite sides of the spectrum, because what's familiar is normally not exciting. And what's exciting and new is often not known and as safe. So it doesn't mean you can't have both in a relationship, but it just means it requires a conscious effort to be able to have that. And it requires that you're both able to sense where you are yourself. So maybe if you feel really bored, then you have a lot of familiarity and safety, and you need to add a bit of newness and excitement. Maybe if you feel quite anxious, then maybe it's because you need a bit more familiar and safety. So by being able to sense how you're feeling and express that to your partner, you'll be able to see where you are on the spectrum. I think the second part to mention is also that we live in a society today where this one person become pretty much our one and all when we're in a relationship. Yes, we have some friends, but we used to have a whole tribe that would fulfill these needs. Now one person have to be our best friend, our soulmate, financial support, emotional support, share interests, raise kids with us, do the housework, be the one to make us laugh, be funny, keep us safe, have an emotional bond, be the one that gives us physical touch, sex and safety. It's like everything. And no one person can give us all that. They are bound to disappoint us. So instead, it's what I think we should do, something I call outsourcing, which is totally natural, which is that look for how other parts in your life, other people might be able to give you some of these needs, so your partner doesn't have the liability of have it all. For example, if your partner doesn't make you laugh, have friends that you have that with that are funny. If he doesn't share some of your interests, have friends that you share those with. It's good if he's curious, of course, but again, it doesn't all need to be on the partner. If you want more touch, you could sometimes go get a professional massage or get some of that from your friends too. And that just takes away some of that pressure, so people don't end up, nagging on each other. And like I said, there's also something beautiful about accepting that disappointment will happen in any relationship. And there's two ways of dealing with disappointment. One brings you further apart, the other one brings you closer together. One is if you just leave your partner to that disappointment on their own and said, I can't give you that, tough luck. That's your problem. That will create distance. But there's also a space where, again, you sit down in a connected way, look at each other, you let them express their disappointment and frustration, which might come up several times if it's something they really want but can't have. And you listen to that and you just acknowledge their experience and say, I'm here with you, even though I can't give it to you. I want to be here and support you in your disappointment. And that can actually be a really connecting experience, even though they end up not getting the thing that they actually wanted, because at least you're there, at least you're present, and at least you didn't leave them alone. And that is how, part of the human experience of connecting.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting. And you clearly seem to have the knowledge, the sort of the psychological and scientific knowledge behind all of this, because sometimes there are so many sort of so-called love coaches out there, but in reality what they effectively are, they're just flirting coaches, which is a very completely different thing. So what you bring to us, Thomas, is very much like the scientific basics, fundamentals behind all the relationship.
Yeah, because I think because that's what I really think is important to understand, that a relationship is two nervous system interlinking, and actually they do interlink, and they know scientifically that after a while our nervous system interlinked in a way where we start impacting each other. So, when we are not that attached, then if I'm stressed, it doesn't impact you that much. But if we are really interlinked and attached, then my stress will start impacting you, and so the other way around. If you're calm, it will make me more calm. So our nervous system actually become more and more interlinked the more attached we are. So you have to see the relationship also as an interlinking of nervous system. So being able to understand each other and regulate each other's nervous system is absolutely key to having a flourishing relationship.
Yeah, that's very true. And I mean, you deal with a lot of couples, you consult, you work with them on building. So what is the most common cause of conflicts in a relationship? From your experience, of course.
Yeah, so I think, people will talk about a lot of different things. So they will talk about, issues with sex. They will say they have communication issues. They disagree on how to raise the kids. There's so many things that people come in with. But I feel that most often the fundamental cause of conflict in relationship is the first of the three things we talked about in intimacy, is safety. And it's not really communication skills, etc. Because the fact is, if one person feels fundamentally unsafe, none of the good books on communication skills will work. They just don't work. All the non-violent communication, it doesn't work if one person is feeling really unsafe. And I always say the reason it is the foundation for a relationship is, imagine, I always say this metaphor, building a house on a hill where there's often earthquakes and there's mudslides. You can build a great house, but eventually it will come crumbling down, right? It will fall down. And that's because it wasn't built on a safe foundation. So the first, before you build anything, is make that safe foundation. And to do that, it's important to kind of understand that as we grow up, you know, the way of how we learn to be with our caregivers taught us different ways of attaching, different ways that makes us feel safe. And these are called different attachment styles. And again, there's someone called Sue Johnson who's written a fantastic book on this. And yeah, we can post a link as well to that, which talks exactly about this. But to give just the fundamentals, you know, we have people that are what we normally call anxiously attached. And they are often categorized as needy, but actually they're not needy. And again, this is I don't like these judgmental terms, but what they do is they have a sense of anxiousness and fear of being left and abandoned. So they might be highly sensitive, they might feel more jealous, etc. And what they need is actually that you understand their attachment style and know that they need reassurance, and they need to know you're there and don't leave them. And what you'll see is if you are able to do that, their controlling behavior, their jealousy actually goes away. And this is not because they're not confident people. Again, we have this categorization of what confidence is. It's not because they're not confident. They can be very confident in many areas of life. It's simply that they had experience when they were small of inconsistent caregivers that might be there, and then maybe they would suddenly not be responsive, or they might suddenly leave, etc. So they have a reason for feeling that way, and you can calm them down, and together you can heal. And then we have the avoidant, which is somebody who learned that their caregivers were not really responsive at all, or maybe they had to suddenly be the adult at a very young age. So they learned that nobody would look out for their needs, and they're often seen as very confident and independent, even though actually they are the one who has been measured to have the highest level of anxiety when they actually measure the stress level. And that's interesting. It's not the anxious one that we think is insecure. The avoidant one actually feel even more anxious. It's very interesting. Even though they don't portray it, we often think they're confident. And that's because they anticipate that nobody will actually meet their needs. They feel they're on their own. And often they have learned to regulate by taking space, and they will often seem like people that fear intimacy, which is partly because they simply don't trust that that's something that can actually be real and that it's safe for them to be there. So they often prefer to be on their own and retrieve, etc. And they can be a bit challenging to be with depending on the spectrum. There's obviously very severely avoidant and just slightly avoidant. There's different spectrums here. And where they might be. But it's important to know, if you're with somebody like that, that when they're stressed, they need to have a bit of space, because that's how they learn to regulate themselves. And then you can try and engage with them again. Then we have secure attached people, which often are I could say, the more easy people to be with, because they're both happy being on their own and they're happy being intimate. And the last category is people that are a mixture between anxious and avoidant, and they can be very difficult people to be with. They often have some kind of trauma, and it means that they will want closeness, but when they get it, they will push you away. And they are very, very difficult people to have relationships with. And again, I don't want to judge anyone that is like that. Everybody has a reason. But very often therapy is definitely needed to have some kind of support to be able to try and make that work, because it can be very, very draining and difficult to be with someone that have that attachment style.
Thomas, very, very interesting. So about, of course, aren't we all a little bit maybe anxious at times and secure at other times? Or do you think these styles are definite for each one of us? Because maybe, that's just saying, if you are in a safety relationship, in a safe relationship, so you feel safe with your partner, you shouldn't be anxious, but maybe that's your nature. And then sometimes when you feel the love, then you're more secure. you end up being more secure, and sometimes you might end up being more anxious. Is it possible that these categories kind of are less sort of black and white, but are more
This is such
gray
it's
area?
such an important point, and I'm actually so happy you brought this up, because I should have said this already. It's not labels, and this is not meant to go tell your
Okay, yeah, that's
partner,
what I
oh,
want.
you're anxious, or you're avoidant, because we are not
Yeah.
fixed. You're absolutely right. First of all, attachment style can change. Second of all, you're right. We all can go on different spectrums, and also they're
Hmm.
interlinked between the dynamic change where we are on that spectrum. So to give you an example, if someone who might naturally feel a little bit anxious about being left is suddenly with someone
Hmm.
who's highly avoidant and pull back, then they will get really anxious, because suddenly that
Yeah.
keep pulling back, and that makes them more and more anxious and trigger them. That doesn't mean they're normally a hugely anxious person. The dynamic is creating that, and that might make the avoidant person retrieve even more than they normally
Yes.
would. Or
Yes.
similar, we can also heal each other, like you said. You can also have someone who's slightly anxious, who is with somebody secure, who can give them what they need, and the dynamic now become a secure dynamic. And even an
Yeah.
avoidant and anxious person together, if they're able to communicate well and understand what the other person needs and can give that to each other, then they can together have a secure dynamic. And so that's a great
Exactly.
point. So
Yeah.
you're right, it's not fixed. It's just that we obviously have a tendency as we come into relationship to have learned to gravitate towards one side or the other a bit more.
Mm. And what it's interesting about the anxious avoidant sort of category, that kind of person, because is I mean, can you become anxious avoidant when you have had maybe a trauma in a previous relationship? Like maybe you've had a very sort of traumatic experience with a partner who has abusive, or not just abusive physically, but abusive like in the personality, like verbally or with actions. So can you become anxious avoidant as a result of a traumatic relationship or a traumatic event in your life?
Yes, so I think absolutely our relationship heals us, and they can also damage us. So there's definitely scope for change. I would still say that the underlying patterns of what we learn with our main caregivers still has a baseline within us, but that doesn't mean we can't shift to some degree. But as an
Hmm.
example, I had, when I was in my young 20s, many, many years ago, I had a girlfriend, it's the only time I ever had this, who cheated on me. And she even made it quite public when it happened, and I was living with her. And you can then say, that would normally then should have made me very worried about people cheating on me
Yeah.
in the future, but it didn't, because my baseline is quite secure, and therefore it didn't really give me, I still don't feel anxious really about people doing that.
Hmm.
So I still think we have a baseline, but that doesn't mean things doesn't impact us. Of course it does. So yes, we can
Yeah.
definitely shift to some degree, but it's easier to regulate yourself back to your set point, from
Hmm.
that place again. And like I said, on the other hand, while we can be damaged, we can also be healed. So if you feel quite anxious, but you're with someone who can give you a lot of that security, over time you might start feeling more and more safe in yourself. Your brain will neurologically
Yeah.
start rewiring itself over time.
Hmm. Very, very interesting. We could talk for hours about these things, really, really. It's my favorite topic, love and affection. I mean, we're like a lot of people are grown up people. We talk about here like mothers and fathers or single parents. And why do couples sometimes get stuck in conflict? Which is
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think the way I kind of address this is, or I look at it this way. So if we have to find our way somewhere, when we have to go to the city or you're meeting a friend somewhere, it's good to have a map, right? We use Google Maps or whatever we might use to get there. But often in relationships, we we somehow just think that we should be able to navigate each other, even though humans are far more complex in finding a restaurant. So what we really need as a couple is to, first of all, have self-awareness and understand ourselves. And then we need to give our partner a map of us, because the better a map they have of understanding our needs, our boundaries, our triggers, the easier it is for them to navigate and help regulate us and makes us feel good rather than trigger us. And I think, again, knowing a history of your partner and understanding what their triggers are is hugely beneficial, because very often we end up triggering our partner again and again and end up in conflict without even knowing we're doing it or what's happening. And you often know you triggered your partner by them having some kind of excessive emotional response to something. So it might be you, let's say you're closing the door very hard and your partner just snaps and say, "What are you doing? Why do you always have to start?" And they get really angry. And the fact is, if you understood their history, you might know that their dad was an alcoholic, and every time he left the house, he would smack the door really hard. So it really triggers her adrenaline response. Again, by understanding each other's histories and triggers, you can now avoid doing these things that then cause that. So this is why it's wonderful to be able to communicate and say, I know for me that one of my triggers is that I always felt that I wasn't heard. So I know that what can really irritate me in a relationship is if I don't feel the other person is hearing what I'm saying. They don't have to agree, but I just want them to acknowledge it. And I know that I can be very pushy to keep saying the same things if they're not hearing it. And I know that trigger, so I communicate that to my partner. And now we can avoid going down this road, because all they have to do is just say, "Yeah, I hear that X, Y, and Z is how you feel about this," and then I'm happy. They can disagree, but I got acknowledged, and then that makes me calm down. So, starting to understand that, and also knowing when you get triggered, what are your triggers, and how do you calm down? Because very often we end up then having logical fights and say, "You did this, no, you did this." And the truth is, when we are triggered, I can tell you one thing we know neurologically: neither of you are right, because our memory is highly distorted when we're in a triggered state. So you both probably don't remember exactly what happened, and that logical argument will never get you anywhere. Because when one of you is triggered, you're no longer having a logical conversation, you're having an emotional conversation, and the logical brain has switched off, and one of you at least are in fight, flight, or freeze response, and you cannot access your logic when you're there. So first, calm down. And how do we do that is then the next question. So you can do what's called self-regulation. That's doing things to calm us down. That could be movement. So for example, the adrenaline response, the fight, flight, and freeze, is because we have a lot of adrenaline, and it's meant to be used to either fight a threat or run away. So do that. Move your body, dance, go punch a pillow, go for a run, move, so you release that adrenaline, and that will help you calm down. Then you can use deep breathing once you've done that to calm your nervous system down further, because they activate the calming part of your nervous system. This is self-regulation. The other part you can do is what I call co-regulation. That requires your partner. And things that can help regulate our nervous system down is things such as eye contact. And again, when you calm down a little bit, then sometimes touch can also help calm down the nervous system. And of course, what I call attachment reassurance. So somebody saying, "I'm here with you. I want to hear you. Okay, I just need you to calm down, and then I can hear what you're saying." That makes them realize we're not going anywhere. Again, it calms down the nervous system. So always realize before you have any discussion about what you think happened, what you're upset about, you need to calm yourself down by using either some of these self-regulation or co-regulation strategies. And then afterwards, you can then sit down and reestablish connection. And when you do that, I always recommend sit and look at each other eye to eye. Don't do it when you're driving in a car, because the less eye contact you have and the less visual cues you have, the more likely you are to misunderstand each other and get into conflict. Make sure you have time and can see each other face to face, eye to eye, and that maybe even there's a touch. And then make sure, rather than going to blame and say you did X, Y, and Z, focus on what you need. Step into vulnerability again. That's how they can hear you and feel empathy. Rather, if you say, "Oh, you're always late, it's so annoying, I'm not going to go out with you again," they get triggered because they feel attacked, and they're going to definitely defend themselves and say, "No, just because you did X, Y, and Z," and you go nowhere. If you instead communicate your need and say, "I really have a need for you to be on time, because otherwise I feel really devalued and it makes me feel really awful," Now suddenly, can you hear how that influences much more empathy in the other person, and they're much more likely to hear you because you express what it is you need and how it makes you feel rather than attack them.
You know, Thomas, this is like a proper action plan. I mean, these are actually fantastic practical tips. It's not like rocket science, but do you actually support and or guide couples in your kind of sessions or therapeutical sessions with couples who need sort of marriage or relationship counseling? Do you do this face to face or with people directly? Because I think people might not be able to do it in a
No, and you're
by
right. And often
themselves.
people are often stuck in cycles. In attachment theory, this is they're stuck basically in, they call it demon dialogue. It's basically a vicious cycle,
Mhm.
and they keep thinking it's their partner that's bad when it's not. It's that they're stuck in a cycle of continuously triggering each other, and they cannot see it's not them. It's a dynamic, and once they see the dynamic, and somebody can sit and actually by just watching them, you are able to highlight and see this is a dynamic you are caught in, and they're basically a specific set of dynamics that people get caught in based on who they are. And then the people can start then recognizing, oh, we are stuck in this demon dialogue, and they can actually stop it. But of course, in the beginning, it often takes someone externally to make them aware of that and
Yeah.
intervene and said, look, this is happening again. And then they can stop personalize it and make it about each other, which already start making things better. And then they can switch and instead remember, oh, I went into attack. And why did I go into attack? Oh, it's because I actually feel unsafe. Why am I feeling unsafe? Oh, and even I have a framework for questions people ask themselves to be able to identify. And then they can say, oh, actually, you know, when you didn't call me when you were out with your workmates and came home really late, I started feeling really anxious. And actually, I would really have liked if you called me and just said you were still out because I was waiting with dinner, and I just started feeling insecure that you weren't here. And that's much easier to hear. And he can say, of course, I'll give you a quick call next time and just let you know where I am, and so you know what's going on. And there we go.
Mm.
It's solved rather than another argument that start draining that emotional bank account.
Ha. I think we all need you, Thomas. I think that you are so calm and reassuring, and you know, I think you know what you're talking about. I wish I have known you before. Many relationships have like gone pear shaped because of probably my lack of understanding of all these techniques and tips and great advice, really practical action plan to
Yeah,
follow. I
and
think
I think what I just want to say to that as well is, because you're right, it's great to have these skills, but what's important is, and we mentioned this before the podcast, is that you need two people to buy into that. So never blame yourself, because you can do everything right in a relationship, and it's not going to work if you're not two people who are willing to engage in these ways. If only one person want to be vulnerable and the other one keep being judgmental, it's not going to work. You're not going to get that intimacy, even if you understand all the theory. If you create safety and the other one keep threatening the relationship, then it's not going to go well. And it's not your fault. It's not because you didn't do the right things. It's just important to be aware. It actually takes two people to want to do this, to be self-aware and to be willing to engage in this way for it to actually work. But if two people have the knowledge and willingness, then anybody can create a hugely flourishing and intimate relationship.
But you know, it's a good point. You know, sometimes relationships fail because someone is more vulnerable and wants to be emotionally available, but the other one doesn't. So, and that's why a relationship can't flourish or can't continue. Really, I mean,
And this
it's a
is why it's
fact.
good to test from the beginning, because you can start, like I said, in every moment we have a choice. Even when you date, you can start out, and people often don't want to do that because we want to show our best side. But what about starting out by actually be vulnerable and see whether somebody can meet you in that space? You know, I did this when I just said really early on, and again, many people wouldn't do that because they say, oh, that shows you're insecure. But I just said, listen, I know that I feel safe when when I know what's going on. So I said, we can date other people or we can date each other exclusively. This was like after 2 or 3 dates. I said, I don't have a judgment either way, but I can feel I have a need for clarity because it feels better for me. And I said that, and that was very vulnerable. And she was able to receive that and meet me in that and said, oh, I'm so happy that you were able to. And actually, she really appreciated it and said, I want us to do. But again, she was too scared because people are often scared of bringing this up because it feels vulnerable, right? But again, she really appreciates it, and it opens up the box for her to start being vulnerable. So there's a way to also test early if people are able to meet. And I would be able to see very quickly whether somebody can meet me in vulnerability or whether they simply are not there yet. And it doesn't mean they can't at a later stage in their life. I'm not judging them, but I'm not gonna. I always say, don't date potential. Date somebody who is actually there where you are at now. Because it's never good to start falling in love with someone based on what potential you think they might have and try and change them. That's rarely going to work out well.
Such a good tip, don't date potential, and also because you can't change people, especially after a certain age. You can't really expect people to change for you, and you can only change yourself. You can't expect others to make a shift if they don't. Very often, I think this vulnerability key is it's difficult for some people to accept vulnerability, and I think I believe some people are in denial of being vulnerable, because, especially men, I would say, because men don't want to be seen as vulnerable, and they want to be seen as being in charge and knowing what they're doing and everything. So I think showing vulnerability might be seen as a sign of weakness for a man, while I think and I believe I feel being vulnerable, I am very emotionally available and very vulnerable myself, and being so open and vulnerable is really good fun, I would say, because you connect and you reconnect with the real you, the real self, and you, at least you can be, you are of course more exposed. Yes, that's for sure. I'm talking about from a user experience, but you feel exposed, but being exposed makes you feel very truthful to who you are. That's my personal view, and that's my experience. I feel vulnerable. I feel my heart is open to be chopped by any butcher or so, like dead meat, but and is very vulnerable and is always open to be chopped, but exposed to be very exposed. But I prefer being vulnerable and emotionally available, because that makes me feel every inch of my skin, that makes me feel every inch of my emotions, and it makes me feel so alive. I don't know how to express it, but even suffering for a heartbreak makes me feel really alive, and makes me feel like I can love with a deep love. So I think vulnerability definitely is a sign of love, when you can do that.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a really important point there, Monica, because you also said about our culture and men, and I think you're so right in the fact that we learn, I think we all do, but it's probably even more on men, this idea that we have to be confident and independent and do everything ourselves, and we have this over glorification of individuality, of being able to stand on our own legs, which actually is in complete denial of our fundamental neurological wiring, which is that we are social creatures. Our brain is a social organ. We flourish through other people. We feel safe with other people. We do depend on other people. And there's something hugely freeing, I remember, for me as a man, because I used to not be able to be vulnerable and buy into all the same nonsense, in accepting we do need others. because a lot of this vulnerability we can't express without accepting that actually we need our partner and they have an important function in our life, very important function. Because a lot of this, when we express our needs, is to say, you know, I need more touch, but that for many men feels so vulnerable to admit that, or even say, oh, I need X, Y, and Z to feel safe, because then they feel they don't look confident. But actually you'll be surprised. And the fact is, if a woman can't receive that, then again, she's probably not on the development stage where she's able to engage with you in that way, and then she would not be able to build that love and intimacy. So you obviously need someone who's able to meet you, like I said. But it's the same reason that a lot of men have ego issues when suddenly, you know, a woman use toys in a bedroom or talk about a fantasy they feel they can't fulfill, because they are grown up with this idea that they should be able to sort it all out and fulfill everything. And it's okay that you can't do everything and fulfill everything. And there's a beauty in just acknowledging that. And actually very, very powerful. So yeah, I think our culture very much is counter intimacy in many ways. And again, if people really struggle with intimacy and feel it's simply too overwhelming, I could really recommend also go do some individual therapy. It could be that there's a good reason. There could have been some significant trauma that basically made vulnerability too scary. There could have been other reasons that they are simply not able to. And again, that doesn't mean you should live a numb life and never experience intimacy. So it could definitely be worth go look at what some of those issues are.
And do you do this kind of seminars for couples or for people who want to do this, want to explore this? Do you run these seminars?
So yeah, when hopefully coronavirus will be over at some point, and then I will run face to face, but also I will be running some online, and I mainly focus on couples. It doesn't mean people can't come as individuals if they want to learn relationship skills as well. But yeah, I think it's mainly couples, and it's good to have somebody, or at least bring somebody along that you feel comfortable practicing these skills with.
Mm-hmm. So we'll post all these opportunities or seminar or webinars wherever they are. We'll post them on the website regularly, so people can tag along or just register with you. And I have one final question for this podcast, and this is also about, you know, like sometimes things happen, like maybe an incident, you know, that how come maybe a little thing, an incident, can mess up a relationship when everything else seemed fine? You know, sometimes little things.
Yeah, and this is something that can be really perplexing for a lot of people to understand. When I heard this before, where people say everything we get on so fine, everything is fine, and suddenly it seems like things have changed. And I think it's really important to understand not all moments in your relationship are created equal. This is why there's something that I call key moments, and key moments are places where your partner feel more unsafe and is really dependent on your support. It could be giving birth, it could be whether they just lost their job, it could be being diagnosed with some severe sickness or losing their parent, whatever it might be. It's normally highly emotional events where they really needed your emotional support. And if you're not there in these moments, then it can breach their fundamental trust and safety. And they simply stop trusting you fundamentally to be a caregiver that's there for them. And even though the day-to-day is great, you go do your hobbies, you have fun, then underlying this lack of trust will be there, and it will start coloring the relationship in a negative light that will cause more conflicts. That will mean they probably start sharing less with you, so intimacy will decrease. And it's really important to be able to recognize that this has happened and realize that there has been some kind of breach and one of you felt left alone, because we have to remember again, there is a codependency in relationship in a way that we are dependent on each other. And we do depend on each other to help regulate each other's nervous system, even if we're also too individual. Actually, I call it interconnected. I think it's better. Codependency is not what I meant. Interdependence. If we feel let down, then you have to have a healing conversation to be able to regain that trust. And there are certain steps to having a healing conversation where, again, I would recommend make sure you have time for just you two sit down again, Have clear eye contact, preferably with nothing in between you. So don't do this in a car or when you're in an airplane. Sit and face it. This is really important for how the brain picks up signals. Then the first part is the partner that was hurt express their pain. Again, try not to do blame language and say you did X, Y, and Z, but say I feel this and this and this. I feel, I felt really left alone when I came home and I said I had cancer and you just left and went upstairs, and I had never felt so alone in my whole life and in despair, and I cried. Focus on how you feel rather than attack them. Then for the partner who obviously caused the pain, acknowledge what has just been expressed, acknowledge what they just said. You can say, I hear that you felt really in despair and you felt so alone, and then accept responsibility for what you've done. And there's a difference between accepting responsibility and agreeing with what was said. So you don't have to start a logical debate and say, no, but I didn't do this, Y, and Z. You can just accept responsibility for the impact your actions had. So you can say, because you do care about this person. So you can still say, I feel, however you feel, don't fake it. But I'm just giving an example. You could say, I feel great sadness knowing that I caused you that pain and that you felt so alone, because I don't want you to feel alone. That's acknowledging the experience without having to whether you agree with the details of what happened or didn't happen. So accept that responsibility. And then the person that was hurt, express what they need from you to rebuild trust. This is important. So they need to think about that before having this conversation. And that can be hard to figure out, what do I actually need from them? And that could be that, I want to start sharing small things with you when I'm scared to see if I can trust you, and then I need you to really be there. And the partner who caused the pain, they then have to commit to making a change, because otherwise how can we trust things will be different in the future, right? We have to accept responsibility and commit to change. And that could be saying, yes, next time you come and share, I'll make sure I put my phone away and I sit down and I give you my full attention and listen to you. And then you have to, of course, action on that. So it's not just words, but through doing that, you can then slowly rebuild trust again. And it's really important to not leave these things unspoken, because they will become something underneath all the things you think might be good that will slowly drain the relationship. So if there's been these key moment breaches, you have to try and repair them.
Well, that has been a fantastic podcast, and I can't wait to have the next one. To be honest, is my favorite subject.
Yeah, there's so much to discuss.
So much, Thomas, and I hope London mums and dads and other singles out there will benefit from our chat. We'll have another one soon.